My fiancé mocked my weight in front of his friends, chuckling, "She's too big to land anyone else. Who'd want her? Besides, she can't run away even if she tried." His friends laughed and I just smiled, saying nothing. 6 months later, I walked into a gala, hand in hand with his fiancé. His jaw dropped as I turned to him and said, "Oh, hi." It was supposed to be a quiet dinner, just Jason and me, a rare night away from our hectic lives. But instead, I found myself staring at the polished wood of the restaurant table, listening to the unmistakable sound of Jason's laughter echoing from the next booth. His voice was louder than usual, filled with a kind of excitement that made me smile at first, until I realized it wasn't excitement directed toward me. "I mean, look at her," Jason's voice boomed. "She's way too big to land anyone else, don't you think? Who would want her? Besides, she can't even run away if she tried." I froze. My fork hovered in midair and my stomach twisted as the words sank in. His friends joined in, their laughter bubbling over in a way that made my skin crawl. The sound felt like needles pricking at my skin, each chuckle a sharp jab. I could feel the heat rise in my face, my heart beating louder in my chest, threatening to burst from the sheer embarrassment. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. Instead, I forced myself to smile, a fragile mask of composure. I pretended not to hear, even though every word hit me like a physical blow. There I was, sitting across from the man who was supposed to love me, the man who had promised to protect me, laughing at my expense. The realization that Jason was capable of such cruelty gnawed at me. How long had he felt this way? Was this what he truly thought of me all along? I didn't know how long I sat there before I finally managed to push the food around on my plate, pretending to be just as engaged in the conversation as they were. But inside, a storm was raging. I had always known that Jason wasn't the most considerate guy. He had his flaws, sure, but I had never imagined he could be this ruthless, this heartless. I had convinced myself that, despite everything, he loved me. That this was just another joke, harmless and thoughtless. But now as I sat there, the truth became undeniable. He didn't love me. If he did, he wouldn't have treated me this way. And worse, he wasn't even aware of the weight of his words. To him it was all just a laugh, a bit of fun to share with his friends. But to me, it felt like my soul was being chipped away piece by piece. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. His laughter, once a comforting sound, now felt like a betrayal, like a lie I had been too naive to see. I wasn't just his girlfriend anymore. I was a joke. I was nothing but the punchline to his cruel humor. My heart pounded in my chest and I felt tears pricking at the back of my eyes. But I swallowed them down. Not here, not in front of his friends. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me upset. I wouldn't show him how much his words hurt me. But the truth was, as much as I wanted to stay composed, I felt shattered. And for the first time I saw our relationship for what it truly was. A one-sided illusion. I had been clinging to the belief that I was enough for him, that I could make this work, that love would somehow bridge the gaps. But now, sitting at this table, I realized how foolish that had been. The laughter continued around me, but I was no longer part of it. I was a silent observer, trapped in a moment where my world was falling apart. The faces around me, Jason's friends, all smiled and joked, oblivious to the fact that their words had cut through me like a knife. Finally, Jason turned to me, his grin still wide, not even noticing the discomfort in my eyes. "What do you think, babe?" he asked, clearly expecting me to laugh along with him. For a moment I just stared at him, wondering how I had ever allowed myself to believe that this was love. Was this how he saw me? Was this how everyone saw me? I wanted to scream, to stand up and tell him how disgusted I was, how much his words had hurt. But I didn't. I simply forced a smile, nodding as if I hadn't heard a thing. I couldn't show weakness. Not now. But in that moment something inside me broke and I knew I could never go back to being that woman. The woman who stayed silent, who pretended everything was okay while the world around her crumbled. The meal dragged on after that, but I was no longer present. My mind raced, planning the future, and all the while Jason and his friends carried on, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. Every laugh, every comment, every glance made me feel smaller and smaller. But as much as I wanted to run, to escape from this humiliating situation, I stayed. I stayed because, deep down, I knew that something needed to change. That night, when we finally left the restaurant, Jason walked ahead, chatting with his friends, unaware of the emotional turmoil swirling inside me. I followed him, my steps slow, heavy with the weight of the realization that this was the end of something. Of him, of me, of us. As we reached the car, I stopped in my tracks. Jason looked back, an impatient frown forming as he turned to me. "What now?" he asked, a sharp edge in his voice. "Come on, let's get going." I took a deep breath, my chest tightening. My mind raced with the words I had been holding back, the words I had been too afraid to say until now. But as I stood there, I knew it was time. "I'm done, Jason," I said quietly, but my voice didn't tremble. It was steady, firm, final. This isn't working for me anymore. "I'm done with you." He blinked, confused. "What do you mean, done? We were just having fun." But it wasn't fun. It never had been. I shook my head, the last of my patience with him slipping away. "I'm done with the jokes, done with the insults, and done with pretending everything's fine when it's not. I deserve better than this." Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. He stood there looking at me, completely stunned. For a second, he seemed to realize the weight of what I was saying, but he quickly covered it with his usual arrogance. "You're overreacting. Come on, let's go home." But I didn't move. I was done. Turning on my heels, I walked away from him, every step feeling like a declaration of independence. I didn't need him. I didn't need anyone who couldn't respect me. The moment I walked away from Jason, I knew that something inside me had changed. I had been through enough. I didn't need to stay in a relationship where I wasn't valued. This was the breaking point. And with that decision, everything in my life was about to change. As I walked away from Jason that night, my heart was a chaotic mix of emotions. There was a sense of relief, a strange lightness that came with the finality of my decision. But there was also fear. What now? What was next for me? For so long, I had defined myself through my relationship with him, through the promises and the affection he had supposedly given me. But now, in the cold quiet of that moment, I realized how much of myself I had lost along the way. I had allowed his words, his judgments, to shape my view of myself. And now I had to rebuild. The days that followed were a blur, a whirlwind of emotions that I could barely keep up with. The shock of walking away from everything I knew still lingered, but underneath it, a quiet resolve was beginning to take root. I wasn't sure how I would do it, but I knew one thing. I needed to change. I needed to prove to myself that I could be better than the version of me that Jason had seen. The version that let him degrade her without saying a word. The version that had stayed silent, afraid to step into the light of her own strength. So I started small. The first thing I did was book an appointment with a personal trainer. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly, but I knew I wanted to feel strong inside and out. When I walked into the gym that first day, I felt like a fish out of water. It had been years since I'd really taken care of my body, and I didn't know where to start. The machines all seemed intimidating, and the loud thumping of music only made me feel more out of place. But I couldn't let that stop me. I was tired of hiding from myself. I was tired of letting fear dictate my choices. I met with Rachel, my trainer, the following morning. She was the kind of woman who seemed to radiate confidence without even trying. Her toned arms, her posture, the way she walked, everything about her was a reflection of strength inside and out. I felt both inspired and intimidated by her, but I was determined to keep going. She gave me a plan, a routine that was tailored to where I was starting from. Someone who had been neglecting her physical health for far too long. At first it was hard. Really hard. My muscles ached in ways I had never experienced before, and there were mornings when I didn't want to get out of bed. But Rachel always encouraged me to keep going. She reminded me that this wasn't just about losing weight or fitting into a certain mold. It was about gaining strength, gaining confidence. I began to realize that with every drop of sweat, every aching muscle, I was rebuilding something that had been broken inside me for years. My belief in myself. It wasn't just my body that changed, though. As I began to see physical results, I started to feel stronger mentally too. The constant self-doubt, the fear of what others thought of me, the fear of being inadequate, all of it began to melt away. It was like a fog lifting, and I could finally see things clearly. I was no longer the person who let others control her narrative. I was no longer the person who allowed herself to be the butt of jokes. I was Claire Thompson, and I was reclaiming my life. As the weeks passed, I began to push myself harder. The gym became my sanctuary, my place of strength and healing. But there was more to my transformation than just the physical aspect. I knew that true change had to come from within. I needed to confront the emotional baggage I had been carrying with me all these years. I started therapy, seeking help to unpack the layers of hurt, insecurity, and fear that I had buried deep inside. It was in therapy that I began to understand just how much I had allowed Jason to define me. For years, I had been so focused on making him happy, on trying to fit into the mold he had created for me, that I had lost sight of who I really was. I had put his needs before mine, his dreams before my own, all in the name of love. But it wasn't love. Not the kind of love I deserved. I began to realize that I had been waiting for someone else to validate me, to tell me I was worth something. Jason's cruel words were a reflection of his own insecurities, not mine. But I had internalized them, carried them with me, and let them chip away at my sense of self. No more. I wasn't going to let someone else's cruelty dictate how I saw myself anymore. With each session, I unraveled more of the layers that had held me back. I confronted my past mistakes, my fears, and the negative patterns I had allowed myself to fall into. It was painful at times, and there were moments when I wanted to give up. But I kept going, knowing that on the other side of that pain was freedom. Freedom from the expectations of others. Freedom from the fear of judgment. And, most importantly, freedom from the toxic relationship that had held me captive for far too long. At work, I started to excel as well. I threw myself into my career, focusing on the things that mattered to me. I worked harder, stayed late, and went above and beyond to prove my worth. Not to anyone else, but to myself. I began to rise through the ranks, gaining recognition from my colleagues and superiors. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something for me. Not for Jason. Not for anyone else. But for me. One day, as I was working on a particularly challenging project, I was called into a meeting with Daniel Whitmore, the CEO of the company. I had never really interacted with him much before, but I had heard whispers about his impressive leadership and his reputation as a man who valued hard work. As I walked into his office, I couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement. Here was a man who had built his own empire, someone who commanded respect and attention. The meeting went well. Better than I had anticipated. Daniel praised my work, my dedication, and my drive. There was something about the way he spoke to me that made me feel seen, valued, and respected. It wasn't the empty flattery I had grown accustomed to from Jason. It was genuine admiration. For the first time in ages, I felt like my efforts were being recognized, not because I was a woman or because I was trying to please someone, but because I had earned it. As the meeting ended, Daniel offered me a new project, one that would require me to take on more responsibility. He said that he saw potential in me, something I hadn't fully seen in myself before. But in that moment something clicked. I was no longer the woman who relied on the validation of others. I was Claire Thompson, and I was capable of anything. With every step I took toward my personal and professional transformation, I was building a version of myself that was unrecognizable to the one who had walked away from Jason just weeks earlier. I wasn't just changing my body, I was reshaping my entire life. And with each passing day, I grew stronger, more confident, and more certain of my worth. But the most important change was the one that was happening deep inside me. I was learning to love myself. For the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone else to tell me that I was enough. I knew it for myself. It had been a few weeks since that pivotal meeting with Daniel Whitmore. I'd pushed myself further than I ever thought possible, embracing the challenges at work, and I couldn't deny that the transformation in my career was beginning to match the one I was creating within myself. I was becoming someone who didn't need external validation to feel worthy, but every time Daniel praised me for my hard work, I couldn't help but feel a warm sense of pride swell inside me. His admiration wasn't like the hollow compliments I had grown used to from Jason. With Daniel, it was different. There was a depth to his recognition, a genuine appreciation for my efforts that resonated deeply. I could tell he was a man who saw potential in people, who recognized the spark in someone's heart and nurtured it. And with each interaction, that spark inside me began to grow. It wasn't just his words that struck me, it was his presence. Daniel wasn't someone who needed to assert his authority with loud gestures or boastful claims. There was a quiet confidence in him, a calm strength that commanded respect. And yet, despite the high-ranking position he held, there was no arrogance. It was as if he treated everyone regardless of their status with a sense of fairness. I found myself drawn to that. I found myself wanting to be around him more, to impress him. Not because I needed his approval, but because I respected him and wanted him to see what I was truly capable of. The day we first had lunch together outside of work seemed like any other ordinary meeting, but looking back, I knew it marked the beginning of something new, something that would change everything. We had both been working tirelessly on a new project. And when he asked if I'd join him for a quick bite to discuss the finer details, I agreed without hesitation. At the time, I wasn't thinking about anything beyond work. I hadn't even realized how much of an effect his company had had on my emotional transformation until we sat down across from each other at a small cafe near the office. There was a quiet hum in the air as we talked shop at first, dissecting strategies and debating the best approaches. But as the conversation naturally shifted to personal matters, I found myself opening up in a way that surprised me. We spoke about the pressures of leadership, the sacrifices we make for success, and the things we'd both learned along the way. And somewhere between sharing stories of late nights at the office and reflecting on past failures, I realized just how comfortable I felt in his presence. His gaze was steady, thoughtful, never judgmental, and for the first time in a long while I found myself feeling truly seen. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about connection. About finding someone who not only understood the depths of my ambition but also the complexities of my emotions. I felt like I could be real with him in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be with anyone for years. But that was the paradox, wasn't it? I wasn't looking for a relationship. Not at all. Yet every time we spoke, every time our paths crossed, something inside me started to shift. For weeks after that lunch, we continued to work closely together on the project, and the admiration I had for Daniel only deepened. There was a certain calm to him, a grounded energy that grounded me in return. I wasn't used to that kind of stability. It had been so long since I'd trusted anyone so completely. Jason had never been that person. Jason had been the kind of man who created chaos in his wake, who lived for the moment and often dragged me down with him. Daniel was different. He was the kind of man who created possibilities. One late afternoon, as we wrapped up another meeting in his office, Daniel lingered for a moment longer than usual, watching me as I gathered my things. "You've come a long way since we first met, Claire," he said, his voice calm but steady, his eyes locking with mine in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "I admire your work ethic. You've got something rare. I can see it even if you don't always recognize it yourself." My breath caught in my throat. There it was again. His ability to make me feel as though I was worthy of more than I thought I was. It was strange how his words held weight, how they seemed to touch places within me that had been closed off for so long. "Thank you," I managed, my voice quieter than usual, a little taken aback by the sincerity in his tone. "I've just been trying to prove to myself that I can do this." "And you are," he replied, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But you don't have to do it all alone." I didn't know how to respond to that. It wasn't an offer of help. It was more of an acknowledgement of the journey I was on, and a subtle invitation to open up more, to let him in. But I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't looking for someone to lean on, not yet. Not in the way he might have been implying. Still, his words lingered with me like a gentle touch on my heart. It was strange. I hadn't expected this sense of being cared for, of being seen. It felt almost intimate even though it wasn't. I shook the thought away. I was imagining things, reading too much into a professional exchange. I was overthinking. The following week we found ourselves working late into the night on a tight deadline. The office was quieter than usual, the usual bustle replaced by the soft tapping of keyboards and the distant hum of the air conditioning. The exhaustion was setting in, but as we reviewed our work together, the atmosphere between us shifted. There was a subtle tension in the air, a quiet energy that hadn't been there before. "I think we've got it," Daniel said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that left me breathless for a split second. "You've done a hell of a job, Claire. You should be proud of yourself." I nodded, but before I could reply, he added, "I don't say this lightly, but I think you're ready for more responsibility. You've proven yourself." His words were like a jolt to my system. This wasn't just about a job anymore. This was about trust, about stepping into a new role that could change everything. And for the first time in a long time I felt ready. I wasn't just capable of handling more. I was ready to take it on, to seize this moment and run with it. "For me, I won't let you down," I said, my voice steady with resolve. I wasn't just talking about the project. I was talking about the person I had become. Daniel studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, his gaze softening. "I know you won't. That's why I'm offering you this opportunity." For the rest of the night we worked in tandem, the hours passing by in a blur. But in that moment something had changed. I wasn't just working for a paycheck anymore. I wasn't doing this for anyone's approval. I was doing this for myself. And that realization, that ownership of my journey, felt more empowering than anything I had experienced before. As I left the office that night, I couldn't help but smile. Not because of the opportunity Daniel had offered, though that certainly played a role, but because I had finally reached a point where I didn't need anyone's validation to know that I was enough. I had proven it to myself. The night of the gala arrived in a blur of anticipation and nerves. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was walking into something monumental. Not just an event, but a culmination of everything I had worked for, everything I had fought to become. As I stood in front of the mirror that evening, the woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who had walked away from Jason just a few months ago. She was stronger, more confident, and finally she was ready to step into the light. The dress I wore felt like it was made for me. Elegant, bold, and form-fitting in all the right places. It was the kind of dress that didn't need to scream for attention because it demanded it quietly, effortlessly. My makeup was subtle, but there was a glow to my skin now, a glow I hadn't seen in years. I felt beautiful not because of the way I looked, but because of the way I felt inside. The woman in the mirror wasn't defined by anyone else's opinions anymore. She was defined by her own strength, by her own journey, and most importantly by the choices she had made. I had worked so hard to get to this point, not just in my career but in my personal life. Every ounce of energy had been invested into rediscovering who I was, and now it was time for that work to pay off in the most unexpected way. Daniel had been by my side every step of the way, not as someone who simply admired my work, but as someone who saw my potential long before I did. We'd spent countless hours together, working late into the night, brainstorming strategies and solving problems, but tonight was different. Tonight he wasn't just my boss. He wasn't just the CEO of the company who had offered me opportunities. He was the man who had shown me what it meant to truly be seen and respected. When I entered the gala, Daniel's presence beside me felt like a quiet shield of confidence. His hand on my back, guiding me through the crowd, was a simple gesture, but it sent a surge of warmth through me. The atmosphere in the room was electric, the sound of laughter and soft chatter filling the air, but it felt as though in that moment all the noise faded away. I was in a world of my own, walking beside someone who understood my journey. We moved through the crowd, exchanging polite nods with colleagues and clients, but my attention kept drifting to the one person who had once been my everything, Jason. I hadn't seen him yet, but I knew he was here, somewhere in the sea of tuxedos and elegant gowns. And as much as I tried to push the thought away, I couldn't deny the part of me that wondered what he would think when he saw me now. It didn't take long for Jason to appear, his eyes locking onto mine from across the room. The moment our gazes met, the air seemed to shift. His eyes widened in disbelief, and for a split second, I saw something I hadn't expected: regret. But it was fleeting, and just as quickly as it appeared, it was replaced by a look of confusion, followed by a hint of anger. Daniel, sensing the tension, subtly squeezed my hand, a silent reassurance that he was here with me. His presence grounded me, and in that moment I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel before. Power. I took a deep breath, standing taller than I ever had before. This was the moment. Jason's opinion didn't matter anymore. His judgment of me, his cruelty, none of it mattered. What mattered was the woman standing before him now, the woman who had overcome so much to get to this point. I didn't need him to validate me. I didn't need anyone to validate me. I had done this for myself. We walked across the room, the chatter around us a dull hum as I focused on Jason's stunned expression. His eyes darted between me and Daniel, clearly not understanding what was happening. But I didn't owe him an explanation. I didn't owe him anything. Not anymore. As we approached him, I could see the confusion deepening on Jason's face. He seemed at a loss for words, his usual bravado faltering for the first time since I'd known him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His jaw tightened as he looked between me and Daniel, and I couldn't help but notice the flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. He was stunned. He was speechless. "Claire," he finally managed, his voice thick with disbelief, "I didn't expect to see you here." I couldn't help the slight smile that tugged at my lips. It wasn't a smile of sympathy or regret. It was the kind of smile that came with the realization that I had finally taken control of my own story. "I'm sure you didn't," I replied coolly, my voice steady and calm. "But here I am." I saw the moment Jason's ego cracked. His face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment as he looked at me, his eyes darting to Daniel for a split second before quickly returning to me. The words he had used to mock me, the cruel laughter he had shared with his friends. It was all out in the open now. There was no hiding behind his bravado. No pretending he hadn't tried to break me. Daniel stood beside me, his presence unyielding, offering no judgment, only support. His hand subtly rested on my lower back, a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that moment I felt a deep sense of gratitude toward him. Not just for his support tonight, but for everything he had done in helping me rediscover my worth. I wasn't just the woman Jason had mocked. I was a woman with strength, with purpose, and with a future of my own making. Jason cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable in my presence. I didn't expect this. His words were halting, stumbling, as though he couldn't quite grasp what had just unfolded in front of him. You've changed. Yes, I have, I said, my voice firm, unwavering. But not in the way you think. You don't get to define who I am anymore. For a moment there was silence between us, and in that silence I felt a profound shift. I wasn't just confronting Jason. I wasn't just showing him that I was no longer the woman he had belittled. I was showing myself that I had outgrown him, that I had grown beyond the woman who had stayed silent, who had accepted his ridicule. The woman I was now, she was strong, she was independent, and she was free. Daniel, sensing the tension, placed a hand on my arm, gently guiding me forward. Let's go, he said softly. His voice was steady, warm, and it felt like an anchor in the storm of emotions that had swirled between Jason and me. With a final glance at Jason, I turned my back on him and followed Daniel through the crowd. I didn't need to see Jason's face anymore. I didn't need to watch his ego crumble before me. What mattered was that I was finally walking away from the past, leaving behind the man who had never seen my worth. And as we made our way to the dance floor, hand in hand, I knew that I had truly transformed, not just in body but in spirit. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up, to stand tall, had finally found her voice. And no one, not even Jason, could ever take that away from me again. The night at the gala had been everything I needed it to be and more. As the music continued to play and the laughter and chatter filled the air, I realized something profound about myself. I wasn't just walking away from Jason that night. I was walking away from a past that had once defined me, from the version of myself that had stayed silent, that had accepted cruelty, and that had felt inadequate because of someone else's perception. I was walking into a future where I was my own validation, my own strength, and my own worth. As the evening wound down, Daniel and I stepped outside the grand venue into the cool night air. The stars above were clear and bright, and the streets buzzed with the quiet hum of the city settling into its night rhythm. But it was as if, in that moment, time had slowed down just for me. Everything felt so right. The world didn't feel like it was moving too fast anymore. It felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Daniel walked beside me, his presence a steady and calming force. He hadn't said much after the confrontation with Jason, but the way he had stayed by my side, his silent support, spoke volumes. He had never once made me feel anything less than capable, never once made me feel like I needed to explain myself. In his quiet way, he had shown me the kind of respect I hadn't realized I deserved until now. I'm proud of you, Daniel said as we walked along the cobblestone streets, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. I glanced at him, meeting his gaze for the briefest of moments before looking away. I felt something stir in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time, a deep sense of gratitude. You don't have to say that, I replied, my voice almost a whisper. But thank you. He chuckled softly. I'm saying it because I mean it. You're stronger than you realize, Claire. I smiled, the warmth in my chest spreading out, filling the spaces that had once been hollow with doubt and pain. It wasn't about the praise, though. It was about the way he saw me. Not just the exterior, not just the polished version that everyone expected to see. It was the real me, the one who had fought through years of self-doubt, through the judgment of others, and who had finally come out the other side. Can I ask you something? Daniel's voice interrupted my thoughts, pulling me back to the present. I nodded, curious. What did it feel like seeing Jason's face when you walked in tonight? I mean, I've seen a lot of people react to certain situations, but that was different. I took a deep breath, the memory of Jason's stunned expression flashing in my mind. It wasn't anger or pride I had felt in that moment, but something much simpler. A sense of freedom. It felt like I had taken back everything I'd ever given him, I said softly. Every piece of myself that I let him chip away at. I didn't need to say anything to him. He could see it in my face, in the way I held myself. I'm not that person anymore. I'm not someone who allows others to define me. Daniel nodded, his lips curling into a gentle smile. That's the person I see every day. We continued walking, the sound of our footsteps blending with the distant hum of the city. As we passed beneath the streetlights, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm settle over me. My heart wasn't racing anymore. The adrenaline of the night had faded, leaving behind a quiet confidence that I had never known before. Claire, Daniel said, his voice suddenly a bit more serious, I know tonight was about reclaiming your strength, but I also want you to know something. He paused for a moment, his words hanging in the air, heavy with meaning. I've watched you grow over the past few months. Not just in your work but in yourself. I've seen the changes, how you've stepped into who you truly are, and I have to say, I'm impressed. I think you've already won. I stopped walking for a moment, looking at him as his words sank in. It wasn't about a competition. It wasn't about winning in the way we'd always been taught. But the meaning behind his words, what he was truly saying, was about something more. I wasn't just standing in front of him as the woman who had walked away from a toxic relationship. I was standing in front of him as the woman who had learned to love herself. Not because of someone else's validation. Not because of what anyone else thought of me. But because I had finally discovered my own worth. I never thought I could get here, I said quietly, my voice breaking the silence. I never thought I could feel this free. You've always had it in you, Daniel replied, his tone soft but certain. Sometimes it just takes a little time, and the right kind of support, to help you see it. For a long while we didn't speak. We just walked side by side, each step forward a step further into a new life. A life that felt fully mine, one that was built on my terms. The next few weeks passed in a blur of changes, both big and small. At work I took on new challenges, tasks that I had once shied away from. I was no longer intimidated by the expectations placed upon me. I no longer worried about falling short. With every task I completed, every goal I reached, I felt a piece of the old, insecure version of me fade away. But it wasn't just my career that flourished. I began to realize that my personal growth was just as important, maybe even more so. I spent more time doing the things that made me happy, things I had neglected for years. I picked up hobbies I had long forgotten about, reconnected with old friends, and began to enjoy the quiet moments, the ones where I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. One afternoon, as I was finishing up some work in my office, I received a message from Jason. It had been a while since I'd heard from him and I wasn't sure what to expect. The message was brief, but it was enough to make my heart stop for a moment. I made a mistake, it read. I never should have treated you that way. I'm sorry. I stared at the message, unsure of how to feel. For a second, the old part of me, the part that had once been desperate for his approval, wanted to reply, to explain everything, to hear him say something that would make me feel better about the way he had treated me. But then I stopped myself. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need anything from him anymore. With a deep breath, I deleted the message. It was a symbol, I realized, of how far I had come. I didn't need his closure. I had my own. That was the real revenge. Not the humiliation, not the confrontation, but the quiet, steady transformation that had taken place within me. I had finally taken control of my life, and that was worth more than any apology or acknowledgement from someone who had never truly understood me. In the end, I didn't need Jason to see my worth. I already did. And that, I realized, was the most powerful thing of all.